Some people fish for fish, others fish for thoughts. Today, I decided to dive. In the beginning, it doesn't seem like such a big decision. It's just a simple impulse, similar to when you stop for a moment and realize that you are thinking. It's just that then you decide to go a little further, not to find something specific, but to come to where that leads. When you enter the water, you still see the surface, the light reaches it easily, the movements are clear, and you recognize what is around you. It's a familiar feeling. And perhaps that is how we live most of the time on the surface of our own consciousness, where thoughts are fast, organized, easy to understand, where you know who you are, what you do, what you like, and what you don't like, where everything seems to have a defined shape. You wake up, follow a routine, respond to messages, we take decisions, we remember appointments. None of this requires much diving. It's like swimming near the shore, where the ground can still be touched with your feet. You know that feeling? And there is a tranquility in all of it. It's a feeling that everything is under control, that you know the terrain where you are. But when you decide to descend a little more, you notice something curious. The surface is clear, but it is also limited. It only shows what is evident, what is immediate, and what is already ready. It is the place of quick answers, of certainties, yeses, of the definitions that you learned to repeat. Talvez be why the surface seems sufficient, because it doesn't demand much. It organizes the experience in a very practical way. To be honest, you don't need to question too much nor look for deep meanings. Just follow the flow that is already there. Nietzsche, for example, used to say that often we prefer the comfort of certainties to the restlessness of questions. Not because the questions are bad, but because they require displacement. And displacement is not always comfortable on the surface. You don't need to deal with that. You can say, I am like this, my life is like this, things are this way. And these phrases, they function as small banks. They delimit the lake, make the water more predictable. But at the same time, something begins to emerge when you look more closely. It's a slight feeling that this isn't everything, as if there were more below, even if you can't see it clearly. And it's a subtle intuition. It's nothing dramatic. Just the impression that what you call I is perhaps only the most visible part. When you dive a little more, you can still look up and see the surface. It continues there, illuminated, organized, but the water begins to change. The sounds get more distant, the movements get slower, and you realize that the clarity that existed up there is not the only way to exist. There are other layers that are less defined, but perhaps broader. Many philosophers believe that consciousness was not something fixed, but almost as if it were a constant movement. It is not an object that you observe, it is almost the very act of observing. And when you begin to dive, this idea stops being just philosophy and becomes experience. You realize that what seems solid, your identity, right? Your certainties, your opinions, all of that starts to become more flexible. Not because it disappears, but because you realize they are just shapes on the surface, almost as if they were reflections in the water. They exist, but they are not the water itself. And perhaps the most interesting thing about this beginning is that nothing changes drastically. You still recognize everything. You still feel security, but at the same time, something opens up. It is a silent curiosity. It is a desire to continue descending, not out of lack, but out of discovery. You realize that the surface is not wrong, it is necessary. It is where life happens with clarity, where quick decisions are made, where relationships organize themselves, but it is not the entire lake. And perhaps the first step of this dive is just that, realizing that more exists, even when everything seems sufficient. And the water continues to be clear, its light still reaches, and you know where you are. But now there is a different consciousness. You aren't just swimming, you are descending. And as you descend, the surface continues above you, tranquil, illuminated, as if to say that it was always there that you lived. But for the first time, you know that it is not only there that you exist. It is exactly at this moment that something changes. It isn't an abrupt change, but there is no clear limit between one layer and another. It is more like when the light begins to decrease slowly, without you noticing an exact instant when it stopped being full. You continue descending, and that's the thing. You start to notice things that didn't appear before, small movements in the water, currents that are almost imperceptible, shapes that have no defined outline. And perhaps it is like this when you observe your own thoughts with a little more depth. On the surface, they seem clear. You think something, decide something, follow through. But when you descend a bit, you realize that not everything is born in such a direct way. Some thoughts, they come from places you don't recognize immediately. Others, they repeat themselves for no apparent reason. There are ideas that emerge like echoes, without you knowing exactly where they came from. And you begin to perceive that the mind is not just that which you control, it is also this broader, more silent movement that continues even when you don't pay attention. William James used to say that consciousness is like a flow, not a sequence of isolated blocks, right? They aren't separate thoughts, but a continuous river where each thing mixes with another. And I find that particularly beautiful. When you descend a little more into this lake, this idea begins to make even more sense. You realize that no totally isolated thought exists. Everything seems linked, even if in an invisible way, a memory that appears without warning. It is a feeling that has no name, an impression that emerges and then disappears. And on the surface, you would call that just a distraction. Down here, it seems like something else. It seems part of the environment itself. And you also realize that time changes. Thoughts do not pass with the same speed. They stretch, they transform, they mix. It is as if the water slowed everything down. And perhaps this reveals something important, that on the surface you believe you think with clarity, but a little deeper you realize there is much more happening than what you name. It's not that the surface was wrong in any way, it's because it only shows a simplified version. It's almost as if the deeper you go, the more things are ambiguous, less defined, and at the same time, they are richer. You start to notice contradictions, right? Ideas that coexist side by side, even being opposites, desires that do not follow a clear logic. And on the surface, you would say, I am like this. Down here, that phrase loses a bit of its strength. It's true because you realize there are many versions of you coexisting. And perhaps that is why this dive begins to generate a slight discomfort, not because it is wrong, but because simplicity ends up dissolving. You stop being only that which you define with ease and start to realize there is a depth that doesn't fit. In a few words, the light will continue reaching, but it will no longer illuminate everything. Some parts remain in shadow, not as something negative, right? But as something that hasn't been revealed yet. Jung used to speak of the shadow as this part that isn't immediately visible, but that is part of who we are. It isn't something separate, just something less illuminated. And when you continue descending, this idea takes shape. You realize that not everything that exists in you is in view, and that these layers only appear when this light diminishes. And that is the curious thing. This doesn't distance you from yourself because it brings you closer, because you stop seeing yourself as something fixed and begin to perceive yourself as something in movement. The surface is there above you, but now it seems to be a little more distant, not because you rejected it, but because you discovered that it was only the beginning. While the water becomes a bit denser, you realize that this dive is not just the descent, it is the discovery, not of clear answers, of course, but of a territory that was always there waiting to be seen and visited. And the longer you remain in this place, the more you realize that the dive doesn't only reveal new things, it changes the way you perceive what always existed. The water now isn't totally transparent. There is light, but now it arrives filtered, as if it crossed invisible layers before touching what is around. And this creates a kind of different sensation. You don't see everything with the same sharpness, but look how funny. You begin to perceive things with more attention, and perhaps it is like this when you start to look inward with more calm. You lose the immediate clarity, but you gain sensitivity. Thoughts stop being just quick phrases and become broader, less defined movements. You start to notice how certain ideas emerge without a clear beginning, how emotions appear even before you understand why, how memories don't come complete but come in these fragments. It is almost like observing shapes in the water that approach and then they disappear. You don't try to capture them, but only follow along. And this changes the relationship with the thought itself. Before you wanted to understand everything that emerged. Now you realize that not everything needs to be immediately understood. Some things just pass like silent currents. This change is subtle, but profound. Because when you stop demanding definition, the experience becomes broader. You stop seeing consciousness as an illuminated room and start to perceive it more as a lake in movement. Heraclitus, for example, used to say that everything flows and that nothing remains exactly the same. Perhaps he was talking not only about the world, but also about what happens within us. Thoughts change, sensations change, our perceptions change. And it is in this dive that you feel this directly. Nothing seems totally fixed, not even that which you always considered an essential part of who you are. This is extremely personal, but with me, a memory arises, and when I observe it, I realize that it no longer has the same weight as before. When an opinion appears, I notice that it can transform. When a sensation comes, it dissolves and transforms. Everything seems more fluid. And this is in no way meant to leave you lost. It is the opposite of that. This is to bring a sensation of freedom. Because if everything is in movement, you don't need to hold on to every shape that appears. The intrusive thoughts, the anxiety that takes hold of us, you can just observe. The depth begins to reveal this, that there is no rigid line between what you think and what you are. There is indeed a continuous flow where everything reorganizes itself. The light now no longer reaches every corner, but the space now is much larger, more silent, more open. And for the first time, you realize that the dive is not just the descent, it is expansion. The more you descend, the broader everything becomes, as if consciousness had no walls, only layers. The surface is no longer the center, it is just a point above, a beginning, and you continue descending. Not because you need to get somewhere, but because you realize there is always more lake below you. At this point, something curious starts to happen. You stop looking for specific shapes. You no longer try to identify every movement, every thought, every memory. The descent becomes more natural, almost as if you were being conducted by the water itself. And that is when the silence increases. It isn't an absolute silence, but a silence different from that which exists on the surface. Up there, the silence was just an absence of sound, if it can even be called that. Here it feels like a presence, a space where things don't need to define themselves to exist. You begin to realize that consciousness is not made only of thoughts. There is something that is prior to them. It is a kind of field where these ideas emerge and disappear without you needing to hold them. Because perhaps that is why many philosophers speak of attention as something deeper than thought itself. Simone Weil herself used to say that attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity, not a tense attention, but a silent openness. And in this dive, you experience something similar. You don't force the descent, you don't look for answers, you simply remain. And by remaining, we realize that the water is not uniform. There are slower currents, denser zones, regions where the light almost doesn't reach, but none of that seems threatening. On the contrary, there is a curious tranquility in not seeing everything with clarity, as if the depth didn't demand an explanation. It just invites us. You feel that consciousness is not the place you need to organize. It is already in movement without you interfering. Thoughts will emerge and will dissolve. Sensations will appear and will pass. Memories will float and disappear. You realize you don't need to hold on to any of it. And perhaps this is one of the first real effects of the dive, the decrease in the need for control. Because when we are on the surface, we want to understand, we want to define, we want to conclude, and here this urgency will lose its strength, not because you decided to abandon it, but because it no longer seems necessary. The water supports you, and you no longer need to lean on anything. And that creates a new sensation, a silent lightness. It isn't euphoria, it isn't enthusiasm, it is just the perception that consciousness can exist without everything being resolved. You continue descending, and the surface is no longer visible with clarity. The light arrives only as a distant glow, but this doesn't generate fear. You begin to understand then, not with words, but with experience, that the depth is not absence. It is another form of presence. Perhaps that is why the more we descend, the more the dive stops being a search and becomes an encounter, not with something specific, but with the very amplitude of what you are. And while the water becomes even more silent, we realize that there is much more space below. The descent no longer has the same sensation as the beginning. That anxious curiosity to discover something new no longer exists. Now everything is calmer, more continuous, as if the dive had stopped being a decision and become a state. You no longer think about going back, not because you can't, but because the depth no longer seems distant. It seems natural. Consciousness at this point stops being something you observe and then starts to be something in which you are completely immersed. And that is when a different perception arises. We begin to notice that there isn't such a clear separation between you and the lake. In the beginning, it seemed like you dove into something external. Now this idea begins to lose a bit of strength. There is no outside. There is no sharp limit between who dives and that into which they dive. It is an experience as something that doesn't divide between subject and object. It isn't you on one side and the world on the other. It is an intertwining. Here this idea begins to take shape. You aren't exploring consciousness as a strange territory anymore. You are this territory. Each movement of the water seems to correspond with something inside you. It's as if every silence seemed familiar. It's as if the depth were not unknown, only forgotten. The light already almost doesn't reach, but this doesn't reduce the space. On the contrary, the lake seems even broader. Without clear references, the perception expands. You don't orient yourself by visible shapes, but by sensation, by presence. And perhaps it is like this. When you stop depending so much on explanations, you begin to perceive what has no name, that which doesn't translate easily into thought. There is a tranquility without motive. There is a kind of attention without effort. I usually say it is a sensation of continuity. None of this demands a definition. It exists before words. And when we experience this, we are able to perceive that consciousness does not need to be understood to be lived. It is not a problem to solve. It is just a space for us to inhabit. The dive continues, but it no longer has the idea of depth as something distant. Everything now will seem closer, even without shape. You realize there is no evident bottom, and the descent, it will never point to a signal. It just continues. And this cannot frustrate. This doesn't create anxiety. The absence becomes part of the experience. Perhaps because when we realize there is no clear limit, you also stop looking for a point of arrival. The dive is not meant to be a journey to find something specific. I think it is more a way of being. You continue descending, and the lake continues opening without hurry, without conclusion, as if the depth itself were infinite. At some point you realize you are no longer looking for anything, that there is no more expectation of finding a hidden answer, nor the sensation that there is something specific waiting at the bottom. The dive stops being a search for whoever one day believed it was and becomes full presence. Perhaps this is the moment most difficult to explain, and at the same time the simplest to feel, because everything continues happening. The water still moves, the sensations still appear, the thoughts still emerge in a light, almost distant way, but you no longer cling to any of it. It is like being inside the lake without you needing to cross. This changes completely the relationship with one's own consciousness. You realize that you don't need to understand every thought to be at peace, that you don't need to organize everything, and you don't need to reach a final conclusion. There is a form of existing even when nothing is defined. Perhaps that is what was always there, but goes unnoticed on the surface. A kind of restlessness that doesn't depend on answers. It is a space that doesn't need to be filled, a presence that doesn't demand effort. And curiously, this doesn't distance you from life. It brings you closer. Because when you aren't busy trying to understand everything, you begin to perceive more. The movements become clearer, even without explanation. The experiences more vivid, even without definition. And the moment more present, even without control. And I repeat again, perhaps the dive was never about reaching the bottom, but about realizing that you never needed to step out of yourself to find something. The lake is not a distant place. It was always there. And you aren't just diving into it. You are the lake itself. Its layers, its movements, its invisible depths, like everything that appears and everything that hasn't appeared yet. And perhaps that is why there is no signal, because there is no point where everything resolves itself. There is no moment when the consciousness exhausts itself. There is only continuity, like the water that never stops moving, even when it seems completely calm. And somehow you are still descending, but now without hurry, just being like someone who finally understands that not every dive is to find something. Sometimes it is just to realize how much exists within you. Well, if this flow of thought made sense to you, I invite you to comment here and bring your perspective on everything that was said and even on what was not said. And if you aren't subscribed to the channel yet, and if you want to be part of this exchange, it will be a pleasure to have you here. Until the next fishing, in this specific case, until the next dive.